Coming up on Arirang News, South Korean President Moon Jae-in is on his way back from the United States and the UN General Assembly. His last stop in Hawaii was a ceremony for the repatriation of the remains of South Korean and U.S. troops killed in the Korean War. Electricity bills will be going up in South Korea in the last quarter of this year. Global fuel prices have pushed the country's state energy company deeply in the red this year, and that could mean higher prices throughout the economy. And volatility in stock markets around the world over possible default by the Chinese property giant Evergrande. It's had to settle a bond payment, and investors are worried about the risk of a Lehman Brothers-style collapse. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. Households in South Korea will see their electric bills go up a bit in the fourth quarter this year. It's been years since the state-run energy company has raised prices, but it now says mounting losses have left it no choice. Ji-young reports.
People in South Korea will pay more for electricity from the fourth quarter of 2021. South Korea's state-run energy giant Korea Electric Power Corporation announced on Thursday that it's raising electricity fees from October. This is the first time rates have been raised since November 2013. An average four-member household is expected to pay a maximum of 1,051 more, or about 90 US cents extra every month. Under the new rates, a four-member household that uses an average of 350 kilowatt hours will pay up to around $46 a month. KEPCO said the rate has been raised by 3 won, or around $0.0025 per kilowatt hour compared to the previous 3 quarters. The hike reflects the uptick in global fuel prices as KEPCO has been suffering snowballing losses. KEPCO's net losses amounted to roughly $570 million during the April to June period, whereas the company recorded profits of around $170 million during the same period a year earlier. In a bid to improve profitability, KEPCO adopted a flexible rating system starting this year that revises its rates every 3 months depending on global fuel prices. But despite higher operation costs, it has refrained from increasing rates during 2021 to ease the financial burden on households during the pandemic and rising inflation. Experts say KEPCO's adjustment may further inflationary pressure on the South Korean economy.
The company inevitably has to take the rise in costs into consideration for electricity prices. There's a high chance that the hike will hurt consumer prices.
As of August, the country's consumer prices have been rising by roughly 2% for 5 straight months. Ji-young, Arirang News.
South Korea's exports for the first 20 days of September increased almost 23% on year. According to the Korea Customs Service, outbound shipments totaled more than $36 billion. Imports rose too, but there was still a trade surplus of a little over $1.1 billion. The rise was due to high demand for semiconductors, metals, and cars. With oil prices high, exports of petroleum products rose on year by 95%. By destination, exports to the U.S. saw an increase of 25% and to China of just under 20%. The Federal Reserve is suggesting that it could soon be ready to start paring back its massive asset purchases, so-called tapering. A timeline or an announcement could come as soon as November, according to Chairman Powell. A rate hike could come late next year. South Korea, which was the first developed economy to raise rates in the pandemic, will be watching closely. Jang Tae-hyun reports.
South Korea's central bank will keep an eye on the country's financial market as there's increasing uncertainty related to the Federal Reserve's tapering plans, which could increase market volatility. According to the Bank of Korea's senior deputy governor Lee Seung-hun on Thursday, the Fed's decision to hold interest rates is in line with market expectations, but there's a chance that the Fed might speed up the normalization of its financial policy. This comes after the Fed on Wednesday sent a strong sign that it's almost ready to taper its bond buying program and could announce this as early as November. In its post-meeting statement, the Fed's policymaking Federal Open Market Committee explained that a moderation in the pace of asset purchases may soon be warranted. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell also said the committee is ready to move, explaining during his post-meeting press conference that committee officials generally viewed that a gradual tapering process that concludes around mid-2022 is likely to be appropriate given that the U.S. economy's recovery remains on track. The Fed restarted its large-scale asset purchases in March 2020 in response to the economic impact of the pandemic.
Today, the Federal Open Market Committee kept interest rates near zero and maintained our current pace of asset purchases.
In the meantime, the officials added that they expect to raise rates by late 2022, sooner than they had expected in June. Jang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
The Chinese real estate developer Evergrande is on the brink of defaulting on its debts worth some $300 billion, causing concern in some quarters about a collapse like that of Lehman Brothers in 2008. Evergrande's managed to make another payment, and the Chinese government has intervened. Some experts say, though, that this worst-case scenario is unlikely, and the impact on stock markets will be limited. Seong Young reports.
Investors are keeping a close eye on Chinese property developer Evergrande, which is at risk of collapse due to huge debts. Founded in 1996, Evergrande is one of China's largest developers, building and selling millions of apartments each year, mainly for middle-class Chinese families. The company has more than 1,300 real estate projects in 280 cities in China and employs 200,000 workers. Twice last week, Evergrande warned investors that it could default on its $300 billion debt, which is as much as 2% of China's GDP. This caused volatility especially on Asian stock markets, since the firm's shares and bonds are included in indexes across Asia. Korea's benchmark Kospi closed 0.4% lower on Thursday. Though Evergrande calmed fears of an imminent default as it said Wednesday, they would make a payment on a domestic bond worth about $35 million that was due on Thursday. The company faces repayment deadlines for staggering amounts of money coming up over the next few years. But experts say it is unlikely that Evergrande will spark a global financial crisis in the same way the collapse of U.S. bank Lehman Brothers did in 2008, and it also won't have a major impact on Korea's stock market.
When the Lehman Brothers scandal broke out, mortgage derivatives were spread across the global market, but most of Evergrande's debt is in yuan, meaning the issue is highly likely to remain in the domestic market. And because of this, even though the potential default of Evergrande can pose emotional pressure on investors, the Kospi, South Korea's benchmark stock index, is unlikely to face panic selling.
The expert added that the main concern is that the Korean economy is highly dependent on China when it comes to exports, and the world's second largest economy could be hit hard if its giant real estate developers goes bankrupt, since it owes money to banks, retail investors, and suppliers. Bank of America on Tuesday lowered China's economic outlook this year from 8.3% to 8% due to concerns over Evergrande. 서은경, 아리랑 뉴스.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Kim Se-won, professor of economics at Ewha Women's University. Professor Kim, good afternoon. Hope you had a nice Chuseok holiday.
Good afternoon, Devin.
Well, let's start with the latest from the Fed and its meeting this week. They say tapering or reducing asset purchases could soon be warranted. Interest rates staying put for now, but Powell says the tapering announcement could easily come in November. What's your takeaway from the Fed's meeting?
On Wednesday, U.S. Fed finally decided to reverse its monetary policy from expansion to the normal policy. U.S. Fed's FOMC indicated in its post-meeting statement Wednesday that it could start to reduce or taper its $120 billion in monthly asset purchases as soon as its next scheduled meeting in November 2nd and 3rd. Mr. Powell, the Fed chairman, said that the Fed officials hadn't made a formal decision on how quickly to reduce purchases, but most agree that a gradual process that concludes around the middle of next year is likely to be appropriate. It means that to conclude those purchases by the middle of next year, a Fed could decrease asset purchases by $15 billion a month if they begin the process October of this year. Also, FOMC left its key interest rate between 0% and 0.25% on Wednesday, but interest rate will be stayed at the lower level until 2022.
Well, over to China, a lot of attention on the situation at Evergrande. Of course, the real estate conglomerate. It's on the brink of default, and yesterday agreed to settle a domestic bond coupon payment. A lot of market watchers worried about what actual default would lead to. Some even talking about a Lehman Brothers situation. Tell us about that and your view, Professor.
In last week, global financial market has been much embarrassed with the rising bankruptcy possibilities of Evergrande, China's one of the biggest property developers. But as of now, market's expectation is that even if it goes to bankruptcy, its impact on global financial market and global economy will be limited. So Evergrande is not something like Lehman Brothers situation in 2008 global financial crisis. Market participants expect that Beijing to let Evergrande default on at least some of its debt, leaving foreign investors to foot much of the bill. They also expect Beijing to protect the many domestic home buyers and suppliers. The developer owes apartment and money too. But Evergrande episodes raises deep-rooted risk in Chinese economy stemming from large debt and bubbles in the real estate market. And this will dominate Chinese stock market for years, along with generating more volatility in Hong Kong market and Shanghai market.
And at the same time, you could say some of the fears over Evergrande have eased for the reasons you describe. And also with the Fed still rather dovish on tapering, U.S. stocks were quite a bit higher on Wednesday, though we're still not back to where we were a week or a month ago. What's the story in the global markets?
During the Chuseok holidays in Korea, global financial market has gone through pretty lousy situation related to Evergrande insolvency issue. U.S. market dropped over 4 straight trading days as Evergrande debt situation worsens from last week. But on Wednesday's market, the pressure from Evergrande shock is much lessened, and U.S. Fed's decision on leaving the key interest rate at current level and its timetable on tapering were kind of well accepted by market. Dow Jones average gained by 1%, and tech-heavy Nasdaq also gained by 1% on Wednesday. European markets over London, Paris, and Frankfurt all increased above 1% for the same reasons on Wednesday.
And here in Korea, coming off a long holiday, of course, stocks were lower today and many of the same issues at play. One name that's done well in the past couple of sessions, though, is Korean Air, looking at a likely boost in earnings to come soon. Tell us about the domestic market.
Domestic stock opened lower today after the 3-day Chuseok holiday, following comments by U.S. Fed that it could start tapering as early as November and growing woes over a default of giant Chinese real estate developer. Kospi dropped by 0.4%, and Kosdaq also dropped by 0.9% today. In Kospi, domestic individual and institutional investors net sold stocks, but foreign investors net bought stocks. As you said, particularly including Korean Air, all airline company stocks gained more than any other sectors today. There is an escalated big hope that Korean citizens are allowed to travel out of country around November as vaccination speeds up. Airline companies' average returns for today was 4.7%, the single day.
Well, a couple of data points for you, Professor, before we go. We have the Asian Development Bank, the OECD, calling for Korea's GDP this year to grow by 4%. As for inflation, the BOK says it'll be 2.1%, the OECD 2.2%. How are those two figures, GDP and inflation, shaping up as we approach the end of the year?
The Asian Development Bank, or ADB, on Wednesday capped its 2021 growth outlook for Korean economy at 4%. As economic recovery momentum has remained strong despite the latest resurgence in COVID-19 cases. The bank's outlook is on a par with growth estimate by Bank of Korea and OECD. The IMF forecasts 4.3% growth for Korean economy this year. Korean economy, which is fourth largest in Asia, is on a recovery track on the back of solid export despite the first wave of the pandemic. The Korean economy grew by 0.8% in first quarter and 1.7% in second quarter. So it means that Korean economy is on the track of 4% annual economic growth as of now. And this year's inflation would be higher than previously expected. Earlier this year, all expected that over 2% inflation would be temporary, but as international oil price keeps on increasing, inflation pressure will be continued until the end of this year.
All right, Professor, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you, as always, for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
President Moon Jae-in has wrapped up his visit to the U.S. and is due back in Seoul in the coming hours. Before leaving Hawaii on Wednesday, he attended a ceremony for the repatriation of the remains of South Korean and U.S. service members who died in the Korean War. Kim Min-ji files this report from Honolulu.
The remains of 68 South Korean soldiers and 6 American troops killed during the 1950 to 53 Korean War are returning home after some 7 decades. South Korea and the U.S. on Wednesday held a joint ceremony for the transfer of the remains at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Hawaii. President Moon Jae-in attended the event, the first South Korean president to lead such a ceremony overseas.
영웅들께서 가장 바라는 것은 한반도의 완전한 평화입니다. 나는 유엔 총회 연설에서 한국 전쟁의 당사국들이 모여 종전선언과 함께 화해와 협력의 새로운 시대를 열자고 제안했습니다. 종전선언은 한반도를 넘어 평화를 염원하는 모든 이들에게 새로운 희망과 용기가 될 것입니다.
Wrapped in the South Korean flag, 2 remains that have been identified are being brought back on board Air Force One with President Moon, showing the highest honor for the fallen. The unidentified remains will be carried home on the KC-330 Cygnus multi-role tanker with Defense Minister Seo Wook. The Blue House said the event demonstrated the administration's commitment to taking responsibility for those who sacrificed their lives for the country and reaffirmed the strong Seoul-Washington alliance. As part of the Korean War Identification Project, the U.S. has been returning remains handed over by North Korea that have been identified as South Koreans. The identification lab of the Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency, which investigates and searches for war dead, is based in Hawaii. 307 remains, including the 68 this time, have been returned since 2012. Last year, to mark 7 decades since the outbreak of the Korean War, the DPAA held a repatriation ceremony to transfer the remains of 147 fallen South Korean soldiers. Earlier in the day, President Moon posthumously awarded medals to 2 independence activists under Japan's colonial rule of Korea, the first time such a ceremony was held overseas. Kim No-di and An Jong-sung were awarded the Order of Merit for National Foundation. They were part of the mass immigration generation in Hawaii and actively supported Korea's independence movement by raising funds on foreign soil.
정부는 해외 독립 유공자의 공적을 발굴하고 후손을 한 분이라도 더 찾기 위해 노력할 것입니다. 독립에 헌신한 분들에 대한 예우를 정부가 마땅히 해야 할 책무이자 영광으로 여기며 끝까지 최선을 다하겠습니다.
President Moon now makes his way back home after wrapping up his trip to Hawaii. Once he arrives in South Korea on Thursday evening, he will attend a repatriation ceremony for the war remains brought back to their homeland. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News, Honolulu.
And the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York saw a three-way meeting between the top diplomats of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan. They discussed the end-of-war declaration suggested by President Moon. Yoon Jung-min reports.
Meeting in New York, the foreign ministers of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan discussed the end-of-war declaration and North Korea's latest moves to develop nuclear weapons and missiles. They met on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly on Wednesday, all three together for the first time in about 4 months. In Tuesday's General Assembly speech, President Moon called for an official end-of-war declaration by the parties to the conflict, including the U.S. and China.
During the meeting, we explained to the U.S. and Japanese sides that the end-of-war declaration could provide key momentum to the Korean Peninsula peace process, and the U.S. paid close attention to our explanation.
The South Korean Foreign Ministry says the three ministers agreed to bolster diplomatic efforts aimed at making substantive progress on the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. After the meeting, South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong held separate talks with his American counterpart Antony Blinken. Chung and Blinken agreed on the urgency of dialogue with the North and had an in-depth discussion about creative and various ways to engage with the regime. The U.S. State Department says Blinken reaffirmed Washington's commitment to continued consultation and cooperation with Seoul and Tokyo for complete denuclearization. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, also joined Wednesday's trilateral meeting, which may have included discussions on humanitarian aid to North Korea. When it comes to global issues, the ministers discussed climate and pandemic issues as well as the situations in Afghanistan and Myanmar. The State Department says the top diplomats also discussed securing supply chains. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And at a virtual meeting of the G20 foreign ministers on Afghanistan, the South Korean government pledged Wednesday to take part in global efforts to improve the situation. Joining the meeting on the sidelines of the General Assembly was South Korea's Deputy Foreign Minister for Multilateral Affairs, Ham Sang-wook, who expressed concerns about the situation in Kabul and said Seoul will join the international efforts to help the country overcome the crisis. The participants at the meeting agreed that humanitarian aid should be provided as soon as possible and called for efforts to protect human rights in the country. The countries also agreed to work together against terrorism. South Korea reported another 1,700 coronavirus cases on Thursday. There was a lull in testing over the Chuseok holiday, so that figure could surge in the coming days. The authorities say they will closely monitor the situation until early next week to decide on any changes to the distancing measures. Lee Kyung-eun has the latest.
On Thursday, after people returned from the 5-day Chuseok holiday, the country reported 1,716 new infections. That's relatively low for that day of the week, given that the figure topped 2,000 on the two previous Thursdays. Of the new infections, over 76% were in the greater Seoul area. Seoul alone reported 645 cases after seeing the positive rate reaching over 1.9% at one point during the holiday period, despite a drop in testing. That represents an absolute increase in infections, largely attributed to major cluster infections. One of those broke out at a traditional market in Songpagu, where case numbers total 408 since the holiday began. And another market in the central district of Junggu, there have been 159. The city has set up extra testing sites near those two markets. Authorities are worried that cases will surge in the coming days as testing picks back up, and not just in the hardest hit capital region, but the whole country. They say they will closely monitor the situation until early next week to discuss what to do with the current distancing measures that are set to expire on October 3rd. They also continue to stress the importance of the infection rate. They say it will remain a factor when deciding on a transition to living with the virus, even after Korea has 70% of its population fully vaccinated. As of Thursday, 71% of the population have received at least one dose, and 43% have gotten both. 이경은, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.